Since the United States had started rebuilding the South Vietnamese army back in 1955, the force had been organized, armed, and trained to fight large-scale battles. The danger had been expected to come from the North Vietnamese or Chinese armies, not from guerrilla bands. Commanders had been taught to mount big operations and to use massive firepower wherever they could. In fact, the South Vietnamese Army's entire structure and military doctrine had been copied wholesale from the United States Armed Forces. Senior American commanders had no doubt they were teaching the South Vietnamese the right tactics for the war they had to fight. Their main worries were about leadership and morale. President Diên had appointed his generals for their political loyalty rather than their abilities, while junior officers' promotions depended on family connections. As for the men, they were sometimes so poorly supplied they had to steal food. Desertions were running at 400 a month. As the NLF guerrillas began recruiting and training all over South Vietnam, they quickly built up their combat forces to 17,000 men and women. These were the main force troops, uniformed and trained to fight anywhere in units hundreds strong. Main force battalions were under the direct control of the NLF High Command, and a high proportion of their officers were trained troops from the north. The NLF were also creating regional and local forces. Regional troops were controlled by district commanders. They were less well armed and trained than the main forces, but their scattered units could come together to create powerful formations whenever they were needed. Local guerrilla units were based in the villages. They were part-time soldiers whose main job was to defend areas where the NLF was gaining control. In villages where the movement's influence was weaker, they served to intimidate opponents and show the wishes of the NLF were always to be taken seriously. The vast majority of new recruits to the NLF were teenagers with no military experience. In the hamlets, they were organized by political officers into three-person cells. Long ago, the Chinese communists had found that 3 made for a group more tightly knit and loyal than any other number. Although some weapons from the north, including Chinese mortars and machine guns, were beginning to reach NLF units, most guerrillas had to use whatever they could get. Rifles and equipment captured from the government army or left over from the French War made up the bulk of the arsenal. There were also secret factories making small arms and turning out grenades and mines in enormous numbers. Local forces depended on even more primitive weapons. Some were designed mainly to frighten intruders, but others were extremely dangerous. Punji traps, Sharp spikes hidden in pits could easily disable an enemy soldier. Punjis were often contaminated to increase the risks of infection. By the end of 1961, the Saigon government was forced to admit it was faced with a full-scale war. Every week, over 1,000 people were being killed. All over the country, the NLF were organizing whole districts along communist lines, controlling education, health, and agriculture. There were whole areas which had seen no government troops or officials for years. In spite of all the setbacks, American military advisors in South Vietnam were still confident the fight against the communists could be won. By this time, they themselves were getting more deeply involved in the battle. Advisors were strictly forbidden to engage in actual combat, but the reality of war was starting to take over. On December 11th, the helicopters promised by President Kennedy arrived at the Saigon docks. With them came 400 U.S. personnel to maintain and fly the aircraft. Within weeks, the helicopters and their American pilots would be in action on the Vietnamese battlefield.